Hi, everyone. My name is Rabbi Geoffrey Mitelman. I am the founding director of Sinai and Synapses, which is an organization that bridges the worlds of religion and science. And I'm very excited to be sitting here with Julian de Freitas, who is the author of a new paper entitled, and I love this, Maimonides Ladder, States of Mutual Knowledge and the Perception of Charitability. He's the lead author. Steven Pinker of Harvard University is the fourth author of this piece, but the four of you and two other people wrote this amazing paper looking at some of the psychology behind Rambam's 8 ladders of tzedakah. I know that you are inspired by two great Jewish thinkers of Maimonides and Larry David. So Julian, I want to turn it over to you to share a little bit about your paper and its inspiration and what you were trying to look at in this piece.
Yeah, sure. And, thanks for inviting me. It's a real pleasure to talk about this work. So, one day Steve, who was brought up culturally Jewish, told us about Maimonides' Ladder and how it was relevant to some of the work that we were doing at the time on how people are really sensitive to different kinds of states of knowledge, mutual states such as like what you know about what I know, and also common knowledge, whether we're both aware that we both know something. And what was really interesting to us about Maimonides' ladder was that many of the rungs of the ladder concern exactly this point. And when we sort of read through it, we thought to ourselves that, there might really be a deep parallel here between the prescriptions that he made and some theories from evolutionary psychology, which predict that, exactly the kind of knowledge that you create could, in some sense, guarantee whether or not you receive either direct reciprocity from the person you give to, or indirect reciprocity as a result of you gaining high reputation as a result of the gift that you give. And so we thought that, maybe Maimonides wasn't just prescribing something that, might be normatively true, but really he was tapping into something deep about our psychology. And, as you point out in one of the Larry David episodes, he too sort of noticed this deep insight, because he donates a wing of, I think, a museum anonymous. He donates it not anonymously, and his rival, Ted Danson, donates another wing, but does so anonymously. However, the fact that he gave it anonymously also leaks out. So paradoxically, he reaps the benefits not only of the gift, but also the fact that he gave it anonymously. And of course, Larry David is chagrined to find this out. So, it was great to be able to bring both of those two great thinkers into one paper, of course.
And what's interesting about Maimonides' Ladder, and if people don't know it, Maimonides, who was a great Jewish thinker, and has written many law codes, and he wrote in a piece about different levels of what tzedakah, what charity would be, from what the lowest rung to the highest rung. Although I think he actually starts from the top down to the bottom. And really emphasizes a lot of the anonymity and how valuable that is, that in many ways, the more anonymous you are, the better a person you are. And yet we as individuals, we want to reap the benefit, as you say, of, oh, wow, look at how generous I am. So I'm curious as to, did you start by saying, oh, we want to look at Maimonides' ladder to be able to see, is this true? Or was it more, boy, this is actually a baked-in methodology that we can explore and use that to untangle some of these questions?
Yeah, I think that it was a little bit of both. I think that we had already been thinking that knowledge states and anonymity were sort of really deep factors in ascriptions of charitability. And then we sort of came upon Maimonides' ladder, and it all sort of clicked together. Not only was he talking about knowledge states, but he sort of already had, in some sense, a set of experimental manipulations laid out so beautifully for us to, capitalize on. So I think it was the two things sort of coming together really nicely.
And if I remember that in your paper, you don't look at all 8 rungs. You selected a few of them. And was that more of a methodological consideration to say, look, we can't do all 8 and we can't do a double-blind control study of helping somebody get out of poverty? It sounds like, if I remember, you selected 4 of the rungs, if I remember.
Yeah, so we don't look at the very first rung, which is, as you point out, to allow someone to escape poverty altogether. The reason we focus mostly on the next 4 rungs is because they have to do with mental states and creating different kinds of mutual knowledge, which fit most with theories of direct reciprocity. Now, in one of our later experiments, we do also look a little bit at rungs 7 and 8, which have to do, as you would know, with whether someone gives grudgingly, whether they're willing to give or not. And in those studies, we look at this idea that aside from whether someone is giving anonymously, which could tell you about whether they're interested in reciprocity, are people also sensitive to this idea that when someone gives, they're also potentially signaling that they're truly interested in engaging in a social relationship that will sort of persist past this first exchange? And also, do they see themselves as being sort of on an equal footing with the beneficiary, or do they see themselves as being sort of in a more of a dominance relationship where they're sort of flouting their status? So those experiments get more at those last 2 considerations. But yes, for the most part, we focus on the rungs 2 to 6, which concern knowledge states.
And I'm curious as to, what did you find in the paper? What were some of the results that you discovered?
Yeah. So, one thing that immediately struck us was that when we looked at people's descriptions of charitability, they cohered really nicely with Maimonides Ladder up until the point where we looked at the difference between a donor who merely shares his or her identity compared to a donor who both shares his identity and finds out the identity of the beneficiary. So on Maimonides' ladder and on the predictions that we initially had, we expected that that last level in which both identities are known, that would be sort of seen as the least charitable of all, because in that situation, the donor can really guarantee that he'll be reciprocated because both parties know what's just happened. And not only that, the donor can definitely receive reputational benefits, say if the beneficiary told someone else. But nonetheless, it was just that last level that didn't fit the pattern. So what we found was that actually, if you just look at what people think in terms of the motives for reciprocity on the part of the donor, then those fit Maimonides' ladder perfectly. So, even for these last 2 levels, people do think that if you create a situation where both parties know each other's identity, that you're probably interested in reciprocity. But then what we found is that in addition to that, people do not only care about reciprocity, but also a little what I was telling you about, where they think that a donor who exchanges photos, one who sort of puts himself out there, is also potentially interested in engaging in a long-lasting communal relationship, and also sees himself as sort of being equal in status to the beneficiary. So we think that these additional sort of considerations might offset the initial sort of negative impression you might get that the donor is, solely interested in reciprocity.
It sounds like there's so many different mental states that are going on here. So it's not just the I'm giving, but it's I'm giving so that I can increase my reputation, and I'm giving so that I can be anonymous, and then I can give anonymously so that I can receive the knowledge there, like what happened with Ted Danson and Larry David. And do I view myself as more charitable because I am anonymous versus I view myself, how do I view other donors there? And so much of our, I know that there's a lot of research that suggests that one reason that our brains are so big is trying to keep track of all the different social relationships and and mutual benefits and who's cheating and the reputational elements that actually looking at Maimonides' ladder helps illuminate just how complicated this question is.
Definitely, yeah. So we think what you just said about, keeping track of whether people are cheating, or even as Robert Trivers called it, subtly cheating. So the idea that, people reciprocate the bare minimum that they need to in order to sort of keep the relationship going. We think that this might provide a sort of explanation for why people are even sensitive to these different kinds of giving in the first place, which is that, people seem to be really wired to find good cooperative partners. And when you think about it, you can see how this way of thinking, which falls out of evolutionary psychology, fits really well with the order of Maimonides' ladder. So if someone gives anonymously, then, by definition, they're sort of removing the possibility that they could get anything from others in return. And so, if you find out about such a person, you should expect that they would make for a really good cooperative partner, because, presumably they will do their part, not only because they're selfishly motivated, but because they're sort of genuinely altruistic. And if you apply the same reasoning to the other levels, then you sort of reach a similar conclusion. So to give just one example, if the donor finds out who the recipient is, then, at a later stage, the donor could always reveal himself to the recipient and say, by the way, I was the one who helped you. And in that way, sort of call in a favor. But otherwise, he doesn't enjoy the reputational benefits until he does that. Whereas if a donor actually, creates common knowledge, if he gives in person, and both people know each other's identities, then in that case, he both sort of guarantees that there'll be sort of some social pressure to receive direct reciprocity, and also that he'll get the reputational benefits of the charity.
Well, what's interesting too is you're highlighting a difference in between Judaism and Christianity in a lot of ways, between what we might call tzedakah versus charity. And that's something that gets talked about a lot, at least in Jewish circles, which is that charity is from the Latin of caritas, and it's about caring, and it's from the heart, and it's an expression of giving, versus in Judaism, tzedakah is related to the word tzedek, meaning justice. That you can even think about the way different religious institutions are supported, where in church it's you pass the collection plate around, and in synagogues you pay your dues, and so it also sounding like this helps illuminate some of this difference between tzedakah, which is often focused more on the recipient, versus charity, which is a focus on the donor. And there's a relationship there for sure, but it's a question of where's the orientation. So I'm curious if your paper helps illuminate that a little bit.
Yeah, perhaps a little bit. So I think that one thing we highlight in our paper is that what people are most sensitive to might be what you're calling charity, which is sort of what kind of donor are we looking at? What are the dispositions of the donor? Is this person truly a charitable person? And we sort of contrast that with just the fact that, when it comes down to it, what should matter is how much the beneficiary is receiving. And, if it's the case that donors are motivated to help beneficiaries by, let's say reputational benefits, then, maybe that's a good thing, because at least there's something that's leading to a net good. And maybe the experiment that makes this point most stark is one in which we deliberately contrast a donor who gives a small amount anonymously. So let's say, $10,000, which I guess isn't that small.
Well, that's a good amount to me.
With a donor who gives publicly. And what we do is we, as they say in econ, we titrate different amounts. So the public donor could give 2 times, 3 times, 4 times, and we actually go up to about 100 times. So a donor who gives $1 million publicly. And what we find is that a donor who merely shares his identity there's basically no amount that such a donor can give to be seen as significantly more charitable than an anonymous donor who gives only 10,000. So it's almost as if how you give is just as important. Now, there is a little bit of light in this tunnel, which is that there are ways in which the donor can still share his identity and then be viewed as more charitable than an anonymous donor. So we find that if instead of merely sharing his photo, which sort of signals maybe pure self-interest, the donor exchanges photos, then if he gives 4 times as much as an anonymous donor, he'll be viewed as more charitable. And then even better than that, if the donor gives in person, then he only has to give 2 times as much in order to be viewed as more charitable. And we think that this last finding might be because, again, giving in person sort of signals, a sort of genuine, down-to-earth interest in the beneficiary, whereas the other ones are sort of more removed and self-interested seeming.
And it highlights, I think it sounds like one of the things that Paul Bloom and Peter Singer and a lot of people have talked about, which is the relationship between empathy and compassion, and the spotlight effect, and that that we give much more to individuals and people that we have a specific, clear, concrete relationship with. We're more focused there than on actually the amount of money that we could give, and how our donations can actually have a multiplier effect, but they're not people that we're connected to, and so they're not as much on our radar screen.
Yeah, no, yeah, I think that's right, and yeah, I think you're right about that.
I'm curious if there are the Hebrew word is sort of tachlis, which means practical pieces, as you're trying to both not just engender donations and charitable giving, but also engender a culture of philanthropy and a culture of donation. If there are practical pieces that you might recommend out of your paper here.
Yeah, I mean, this is always the challenging part. And one thing we do say in the paper is that, to some extent, the most efficient, well-known charities that already exist might be capitalizing on some of these quirks of psychology already. So even, really careful, efficient charitable organizations such as the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation often feature photos with the donors and the recipients. And I think that, our findings at least suggest that sort of practice is pretty wise. It suggests that the organization in so doing really signals that it has a genuine interest in the beneficiary, and sort of bringing these rich donors sort of down to the levels of these beneficiaries, and sort of thinking about their interests on a level playing field in some sense. So, that's one thing in which we say where, this sort of parallel here that we're already seeing. I guess another general message here is that, there are ways in which, if you want to incentivize donors to give, you could achieve this goal while still being smart. So, merely sending a photo is probably not going to do very good for the donor, and could even sort of backfire. But giving in person, or showing in other ways that you're sort of genuinely interested and see yourself as being on an equal footing, could both sort of make sure that the donor's reputation gets shared, while helping the beneficiary. And that's the challenge, which is trying to meet all interests. One of the examples that we talk about in the paper is that of Dan Pallotta. I'm not actually sure if I'm pronouncing his last name correctly, but he started a bunch of fundraising events for cancer research, such as various running events and cycling events where people would get sponsored to do certain miles, I think. But because he was also making a profit from this, the whole sort of initiative got tainted, and people no longer were interested in it. So it's all to say that, for better or for worse, people have a certain psychology that's attuned to certain features. And so at least if you're trying to cater to that, then there might be smart ways of doing that. Now, of course, there's maybe a last thing you could say, which is a more meta point, which is that we should probably be changing the way that we think about these things. So maybe being attuned to dispositions, matters and makes sense a lot in the sort of small scale, day-to-day social interactions that we have, and that were probably common in our sort of ancestral environment. But when we're talking about doing net good in a charitable scenario, maybe we need to learn how to somehow slough that off, because those concerns are sort of much more secondary to the main one, which should be doing the most good.
There's a line from the Talmud that says in the Shema, in the Shema Ve'ahavta, which is the central prayer that Jews say twice a day, every day, says you should love Adonai your God with all your heart, b'chol levavcha. And the rabbis say, well, how do you love God with all your heart? And the rabbis say that is not just all the good parts, what's called your Yetzer HaTov, but also your Yetzer Hara, your evil inclination, your selfish inclination, and to be able to use that. If you need to use your ego to be able to do some good, you can use that. In fact, that's a way. If you need to be able to say the anonymous / Ted Danson wing, that's still going to be saving X number of lives in that kind of way.
Yeah, definitely. I love that. I think that's a message that, if it becomes more palatable, we'll probably achieve the most good. I think in a lot of charitable contexts, there's this idea that it has to be completely self-serving. Basically, it has to be kind of anonymous. And, of course, we know that the most successful organizations attract smart thinkers, have a lot of research behind the scenes, and all of this takes money and some sort of incentivized way of growing the organization. And so, if people can sort of focus on the factors that actually matter, like low overhead costs, but still maximum net benefit, then that's the way to go. And there are people who are definitely interested. Peter Singer being one among many, Paul Bloom another, in how we sort of give efficiently and sort of move people away from the factors that they're sort of intuitively and automatically that they intuitively glom onto, and get them to focus on the things that should actually matter, sort of rationally speaking.
So I think the last question that I want to ask is, and you mentioned this a little bit before, would you say, even though he was a scientist, he was a doctor at the time, but he didn't have the tools of psychology, it sounds like Maimonides had a pretty good sense of intuitive psychology and how to motivate giving. And so would you say that it sounds like his hypothesis, which has been, as you said, normative, there actually may be some at least some intuitive science to his ideas?
Yeah, definitely. We think that Maimonides was a man way ahead of his time, and for that reason, we wanted to give him due credit throughout the paper. And so in sort of every experiment we do, we come back to the ladder. And as you point out, he was making a normative theory, but I think in a lot of philosophy, for example, the argument often goes that if you have a theory that also explains most of people's intuitions, that one will perhaps be the best and most long-standing theory. And we do think that much of the ladder sort of captures people's intuitions in the domain of ascribing charitability. And it might be for these really deep reasons, which, somehow Maimonides was in touch with. And so, we think that this ladder will probably stand the test of time, and hopefully continue to engender more research into the kinds of factors that affect people's ascriptions of charitability.
Well, Julian, thank you for taking the time to talk and for this fascinating paper. We'll link to the paper here as well so people can see that, and also the ladder itself so that people can see a little detail on this. But it's such important and fascinating work. So thank you for your time and the insights that you're bringing to psychology and religion.
Oh, thanks for having me. It's been a real pleasure chatting with you. And, I hope to see more of you and the organization's good work in the future.
Thank you so much.